1. Fiona Beal. Fiona Beal was a primary school teacher in Northampton, widely regarded as calm, diligent, and trusted with a Year 6 class. In her early 50s at the time of the crime and arrest, she appeared to colleagues and parents as a steady professional who guided pupils through lessons and looked after their welfare. Friends saw a long-term relationship at home with her partner builder, Nicholas "Nick" Billingham. Nothing in her public image hinted at what was to come, which is why this case rattled a community that had believed it knew her. Behind the classroom routine, the relationship was said to be turbulent. Her defense later described years of depression and a coercive on-off partnership. Prosecutors countered that her actions were calculated and planned. In her journals, she sketched an inner persona she called an alter ego and recorded plans and reflections that would later become central evidence. Whatever the private tensions, the writing suggested intent rather than an impulsive break. None of these factors excuse what she did. They help explain how a teacher's life and choices slid into darkness. In November of 2021, inside the couple's home in Northampton, Beal killed Nicholas Billingham. What followed was a methodical cover-up. She hid his body in a grave by the side of the house and concealed the area, then told relatives, colleagues, and parents that Nick had left her. She sent messages from his phone to maintain the illusion that he was alive and away. During these months, she kept teaching and even invoked pandemic isolation to explain her absence when necessary, presenting normality in public while sustaining a private deception. The narrative here is chilling not for its gore, but for its cold persistence. The investigation turned when Beal's mental state appeared to unravel. In March of 2022, she traveled to a holiday cabin in Cumbria where police alerted by concerned relatives found her and recovered journals that contained detailed admissions. Those writings led officers back to Northampton where they discovered Nicholas Billingham's remains at the property the couple shared. Beal was arrested and charged. The first trial the following year was aborted over an issue with a defense witness. A retrial began at the Old Bailey in April of 2024. A few days and Beal changed her plea and admitted murder. At sentencing in late May of 2024, the Recorder of London, Mr. Justice Mark Lucraft imposed a mandatory life term with a minimum of 20 years before parole can even be considered. In clear terms, the judge condemned the premeditation and the extended deceit directed at both families and friends. Official statements emphasized how her own words preserved in the journals had helped expose the truth, and prosecutors underlined that she continued working as a teacher during the concealment. Public reaction was one of shock and sorrow, with powerful statements from Nicholas's family describing the devastation left behind. What motivated her? The court heard competing narratives, allegations of coercive control, and a history of low mood on one side and, on the other, a portrait of deliberate planning captured in her notes and actions. Experts pointed to the journals as evidence of forethought and a controlled step-by-step approach. Her role as a teacher may have aided the facade organized, reliable adept at managing appearances, but it also deepened the community's sense of betrayal when the facts emerged. This story must end with moral clarity. A respected educator took a life and then lied about it for months, compounding the harm to a family and corroding trust in a profession built on care. Whatever personal struggles existed, they do not diminish responsibility. Justice required accountability, and the court delivered it. We remember Nicholas Billingham as a son, a father, and a friend, and we acknowledge the irreversible loss suffered by those who loved him. The lesson to carry forward is sober and simple. Behind every headline are real people, and the measure of a society is how firmly it stands with victims and upholds the truth. 2. Chelsea Watrous Cook. Chelsea Watrous Cook was a high school health and yoga teacher in Lehi, Utah, known on campus for calm authority and a focus on wellness. In her early 30s at the time of the crime and arrest, she was also a mother to twin toddlers, and recently divorced from her ex-husband, Travis Cook. Colleagues and students knew her as organized and dedicated. Parents encountered a professional voice who spoke about healthy choices. That public image, however, would be shattered by a domestic tragedy that unfolded far from the classroom but forever altered how a community remembered a teacher. Tensions simmered in the months after the breakup as new relationships formed and custody routines hardened into habit. Prosecutors later described jealousy and anger building over time, and the victim's family told reporters they believed harassment had escalated online and in person. Whatever the competing narratives, the signs pointed to a conflict that was not cooling. The warning, voiced by the victim's mother after the killing, was stark fear for her daughter's safety had become part of daily life. These are the fragile, combustible circumstances that can turn ordinary disagreements into life-altering crime. On a Sunday evening in late November of 2018 in Midvale, Chelsea arrived at her ex-husband's apartment complex with a pretext that sounded mundane, dropping off cold medicine for their twins. Messages drew Travis outside to meet in the parking area, but while he stepped away, she went upstairs and slipped into the apartment where his new girlfriend, Lisa Violet Williams, was decorating a Christmas tree with the children. When Travis returned, he found Chelsea inside and told her to leave. She refused, briefly locked herself in the bathroom, then came out to her coat, produced a handgun, and fired at Lisa in front of the twins. Lisa, 26 years old, died from her wounds. The children were not physically harmed, but what they witnessed cannot be undone. The immediate aftermath was chaotic. Travis wrested the weapon away and, fearing there might be another gun in the coat, pinned Chelsea until officers arrived. Police records and contemporaneous reporting describe surveillance footage, text messages, and witness accounts that fit together into a tight, tragic timeline. Chelsea was arrested at the scene and booked into the Salt Lake County Jail on suspicion of aggravated murder and related charges. The facts were domestic, intimate, and devastating, and they reached the public quickly through local and national news. As the case moved forward, prosecutors filed aggravated murder, aggravated burglary, and firearm-related counts along with misdemeanor charges for committing a violent offense in front of children. In February of 2020, Chelsea pleaded guilty. Coverage at the time noted her subdued demeanor in court, with emotion surfacing when the charges involving her children were read. The plea removed the possibility of a death sentence and set the case for sentencing, shifting the legal question from guilt to how long she would be incarcerated. In late June of the same year, a third district court judge imposed an indeterminate prison term built from consecutive sentences, a 25 to life term for aggravated murder, a 6 to life term for aggravated burglary, and an additional 3 to 5 years for a firearm offense. In plain terms, the structure means she must serve at least 34 years before the parole board can even consider release, and the board may decide she remains in prison for the rest of her life. The courtroom statements emphasize the gravity of killing in front of young children and the lasting harm to the victim's family. Public response mixed sorrow and anger. For educators in Utah, the case felt like a breach of trust. A teacher whose job was to model stability and care had brought violence into a domestic space where 2 small children were present. Reporters told the victim's story with detail and dignity, underscoring that Lisa Williams was a daughter, a friend, and a young woman preparing holiday decorations with children when she was killed. Her family's voices became part of a wider conversation about warning signs, restraining boundaries, and how communities can recognize and respond to escalating domestic conflict. What drove Chelsea's actions? The available record points to jealousy, anger, and fixation rather than psychosis. Court documents and interviews describe a pattern of harassment and a calculated plan that used a believable errand to gain access to the apartment. Her training as a teacher may have contributed to a composed outward appearance, but it did not mask intent. Experts did not center the case on complex clinical diagnoses. The narrative that emerged in court was one of choice preparation and a refusal to walk away. Nothing in that analysis blurs accountability. This story ends with a clear moral line. A woman who once held a position of trust took another person's life and inflicted lasting trauma on 2 children and on grieving relatives who must now carry birthdays, holidays, and ordinary days without Lisa. No personal struggle justifies that harm. Justice, in this case, required a firm sentence and an unambiguous acknowledgement of responsibility. Remembering Lisa Violet Williams with respect and compassion, We reject any narrative that romanticizes the offender and stand with families whose lives are torn apart by domestic violence. Let this be a sober caution when jealousy hardens into obsession. The only responsible choice is distance help and intervention before a preventable tragedy becomes permanent. 3. Amy Bishop. Amy Bishop, also known as Amy Bishop Anderson, was a biology professor at the University of Alabama in Huntsville, a scholar with a doctorate from Harvard University and a mother of 4. In her mid-40s at the time of the crime and arrest, she taught courses in neuroscience and anatomy and had cultivated an image of an intense, ambitious academic devoted to laboratory work and publication. Colleagues remembered a driven researcher whose career had begun with promise. That public face set against the authority and responsibility of a faculty role is what made the events that followed so profoundly shocking to a campus community. In the months leading up to the shooting, Bishop's professional life was under severe strain. She had been denied tenure, a professional blow that can end a scholarly career at a research university. At the same time, reporters and investigators began to note earlier episodes that hinted at volatility, including the death of her younger brother in Massachusetts. In the 1980s, a case long labeled an accident, but later re-examined after the Huntsville attack. None of this history excuses what happened. It does, however, sketch a portrait of mounting pressure grievance and unresolved anger. On a Friday, in mid-February of 2010, during a routine biology department meeting inside the Shelby Center on the Huntsville campus, Bishop sat among colleagues as agendas were discussed and ordinary business proceeded. Witnesses later described her rising partway through the meeting and opening fire at those seated nearby. 3 professors were fatally wounded: Department Chair Gopi Podila, plant biologist; Maria Ragland Davis, an expert in molecular genetics; and Adriel Johnson, a respected teacher and researcher. 3 others were struck and survived. The terror ended when her weapon jammed, creating a pause that allowed colleagues to push her from the room and disarm her. Police took Bishop into custody shortly afterward. Investigators gathered eyewitness accounts, surveillance evidence, and records of her long-tenured dispute. Prosecutors charged her with capital murder and attempted murder. Months of pretrial motions followed, but the essentials never changed. A faculty meeting had become a crime scene, and the ripple effects washed across a university and the families of 6 victims. The case drew national attention in part because a woman carrying out a mass shooting in an academic workplace is exceedingly rare. In early autumn of 2012, Bishop pleaded guilty to capital murder and attempted murder. Under Alabama law, even a guilty plea to a capital charge requires jurors to hear a condensed presentation of evidence. After that proceeding, a judge imposed life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. Several victims' relatives expressed opposition to a death sentence, and prosecutors cited those views in agreeing to resolve the case by plea rather than pursue execution. Bishop is serving her sentence at the Julia Tutwiler Prison for Women. What motivated her has been debated, but the record points to a combustible mix of humiliation, anger, and fixation surrounding her failed tenure bid not to a sudden break from reality. Feature reporting and court coverage describe a long pattern of conflict and grievance, with colleagues recalling tense interactions and a tendency toward outbursts. Experts who examined the case forensically focused less on complex diagnoses and more on preparation and intent, a calculated decision to bring a firearm to a meeting where unarmed co-workers were confined in a small room with a single exit. As with any assessment of motive, nuance matters, but accountability must remain clear. Her role as a teacher deepened the shock. Students and junior researchers looked to faculty for guidance, fairness, and safety. When someone entrusted with those duties turns a scholarly space into a place of fear and loss, the harm radiates outward to the families who lost beloved people, to the injured who carry lasting scars, and to a campus that must rebuild trust, one conversation, one class, one memorial at a time. Newsrooms across the country told those stories, amplifying the voices of survivors who described quick-thinking courage and the aching absence left behind. This narrative ends with moral clarity. 3 educators were killed while doing their work, 3 others were injured and countless lives were changed. Whatever pressures Bishop felt, they do not mitigate responsibility. The court sentence reflects that truth and affirms the primacy of life, safety, and the rule of law. We honor Dr. Gopi Podila, Dr. Maria Ragland Davis, and Dr. Adriel Johnson by saying their names with respect, by standing with their families, and by insisting that academic conflicts never escalate into violence. Justice required certainty, and the outcome delivered it. The lesson is sober and lasting. When grievance hardens into obsession, intervention and distance are the only acceptable choices. 4. Nancy Ann Seaman. Nancy Ann Seaman was a respected elementary school teacher at Longacre Elementary in Farmington Hills, known for patience in the classroom and for the kind of calm presence parents trusted. In her early 50s at the time of the crime and arrest, she had built a life centered on teaching and on raising 2 sons. Colleagues described an award-winning educator. Neighbors saw a tidy home and a dedicated mother. Nothing in that public portrait prepared her community for the truth that would emerge from inside the Seaman residence. Behind that facade, the marriage of Nancy and Robert Bob Seaman was unraveling. In court and in interviews, she described years of turmoil and alleged abuse, while prosecutors painted a different picture, a relationship in collapse, financial and emotional strains, mounting and anger, hardening into grievance. Family members and reporters would later recount how tensions escalated in the months leading up to the killing, a context that is important to understand, but does not excuse what followed. On a Monday in mid-May of 2004, inside the couple's garage in Farmington Hills, an argument turned deadly. The evidence would show that Nancy used a hatchet and later a kitchen knife during the fatal assault on her husband. Instead of calling authorities, she concealed what had happened and left for school to teach her class when she could not secure a substitute, returning later to the house. Investigators and reporters would later emphasize that decision to continue a normal routine as part of the chilling pattern of the day. In the hours and days after the killing, Nancy undertook a series of deliberate steps to hide the crime. Court records describe purchases of cleaning supplies, repainting in the garage, and efforts to conceal Robert's body by wrapping and placing it in her vehicle at the home. Surveillance footage and transactions tied her to a recently purchased hatchet and appellate records describe a later attempt to return a similar hatchet using the prior receipt. Relatives reported Robert missing, and when police came to check on him, they eventually discovered his remains and arrested Nancy. The investigation moved quickly from shock to charge. Prosecutors in Oakland County filed first-degree premeditated murder, arguing that her actions before and after the killing demonstrated planning and an effort to mislead. The case drew steady media attention, a teacher accused of killing her husband, a divided family, and a legal battle over whether years of alleged abuse could be weighed by jurors and experts under Michigan law. Local and national outlets covered the proceedings as the story traveled from the school district to the courthouse. A jury found Nancy guilty of first-degree murder, a conviction that under Michigan law carries a mandatory life sentence. The trial judge later attempted to reduce the conviction to second-degree murder, but the Michigan Court of Appeals reinstated the original verdict. On the state's offender registry, she appears as serving life for first-degree premeditated murder. Years later, a federal district judge conditionally granted a new trial based on how the defense handled expert testimony about battered spouse syndrome, but the United States Court of Appeals for the Sixth Circuit reversed, concluding that the defense had been presented within the limits of Michigan law. The result left the conviction and the life sentence intact. As to motive and psychology, the record points to a marriage in crisis and to a defendant who, according to prosecutors, planned and carried out a killing and then concealed it. The defense framed her actions as self-defense in the context of long-term abuse. Expert witnesses discussed patterns associated with battered spouse syndrome, though courts limited the scope of that testimony. Her role as a teacher deepened the public sense of betrayal. An adult charged with guiding children towards safety and honesty instead brought deception and death into her own home. This story must end with moral clarity. A man lost his life Two sons lost their father, and a community lost trust in someone who had once been a model educator. Whatever turmoil existed in the marriage, it does not lessen responsibility for a deliberate killing or for the choice to hide it. The legal outcome reflects that accountability. Remembering Robert Seaman with respect, we acknowledge the irrevocable harm done to his family and to a profession that relies on integrity and care. The lesson for audiences and communities alike is sober and enduring when domestic conflict escalates. The only responsible path is distance, help, and intervention, never violence. 5. Pamela Ann Smart. Pamela Ann Smart worked as the media coordinator at Winnicott High School in Hampton, New Hampshire, a role often described as a teaching position because she supervised student media projects and helped run an anti-drug program. In her early 20s, at the time of the crime and arrest, she presented as energetic, organized, and ambitious. Friends saw a newlywed beginning adult life. Colleagues encountered a young professional who spoke with authority about communications and student outreach. That public image, grounded in education and mentorship, would collide with one of the most notorious murder cases in modern American true crime. Beneath that surface, prosecutors later argued jealousy and fear of divorce hardened into a dangerous mix. Smart began a sexual relationship with a 15-year-old student intern, William Billy Flynn, and according to the state's case, nurtured a fantasy of a future with him that could only exist if her husband were out of the picture. The pressure of a failing marriage, the lure of control, and the imbalance of power between an adult school employee and a teenager formed a combustible triangle. In this telling, the crisis was not sudden. It unfolded across weeks in private conversations and promises that corrupted her professional role. On the evening of early May, in the year 1990, inside the Smarts' dairy condominium, Flynn and friends entered while Pamela was away at work. Greg Smart, an insurance agent in his 20s, was ambushed and shot. The state's timeline placed Pamela at her job to create an alibi while the teens carried out the killing. In the days that followed, investigators began to receive tips from students and acquaintances, and they focused on the unusual closeness between the media coordinator and her teen intern. What set this case apart was not just the brutality of a husband slain at home, but the allegation that an adult in a school setting had manipulated a teenager to commit the crime. Detectives wired another teen, Cecilia Pierce, to record conversations with Pamela. Those tapes became the centerpiece of the prosecution, capturing Pamela urging Pierce to lie to police and speaking in ways jurors later said revealed foreknowledge of the crime. In court, the recordings were played again and again. Jurors would later tell reporters that the tapes were decisive in their verdict. This evidence transformed rumor into a narrative of planning and pressure, replacing speculation with the sound of Pamela's own words. Arrest followed and the trial unfolded in Rockingham County Superior Court. It became one of the first American criminal trials broadcast wall-to-wall on local television, placing a small New England courtroom before a national audience. Prosecutors charged Pamela as an accomplice to first-degree murder with conspiracy and witness tampering. The defense insisted the teenagers acted alone to impress each other and shift blame, but the state's case, anchored by the recordings and by testimony from the teens, prevailed. In late March of 1991, a jury found her guilty on all major counts. The judge imposed the mandatory sentence under New Hampshire law, life in prison, without the possibility of parole. Appeals followed. In early 1993, the New Hampshire Supreme Court affirmed the convictions. Over the decades, Pamela petitioned for commutation and pursued other relief without success. She was transferred in the early 1990s to the Bedford Hills Correctional Facility in New York, where New Hampshire continues to list her as serving a life without parole term. As of mid-2025, local coverage in New Hampshire still records her status as incarcerated for life with no parole. Media interest never faded. Reporters noted the unusual elements a young school media coordinator entangled with a teenager's secret tapes and a gavel-to-gavel broadcast that helped shape public memory of the case. In recent years, Pamela released statements accepting responsibility for her husband's death, acknowledging that her actions and influence set events in motion, even as she has at times disputed the extent of her role. Those public acknowledgments accompanied renewed pleas for clemency, which state officials received but did not grant. What motivated Pamela Smart? The record points to a blend of grievance, fear of losing status and control through divorce, and a manipulative dynamic with a vulnerable teenager. Expert labels are less important than the clear through-line choices were made, pressure was applied, and a boundary that should be absolute for any educator was crossed again and again. Her job amplified the breach of trust. The authority of an adult in a school setting was leveraged for personal ends that ended in a man's death. That reality deepened the shock to students, parents, and teachers watching from afar. This story must end with moral clarity. Greg Smart was a son, a friend, and a husband, and his life was taken. A school professional who should have modeled ethics and restraint instead fostered secrecy, exploited a teenager, and drove a deadly plan. Whatever personal turmoil she faced, it does not mitigate responsibility. The court's sentence reflects the gravity of the betrayal and the permanence of the harm. We remember Greg Smart with respect, stand with his family, and affirm a standard that should never bend. Educators must safeguard young people and meet conflict with lawful, humane choices. When obsession and manipulation appear, the only acceptable response is distance, help, and intervention, never violence. 6. Carolyn Warmus. Carolyn Warmus was a young elementary school teacher in Westchester County, known for polished confidence and a poised manner that read as maturity beyond her years. In her mid-20s at the time of the crime and arrest, she worked alongside fellow teacher Paul Solomon, while newly navigating adult life in the suburbs just north of New York City. To colleagues, she could appear composed, fashionable, and ambitious. To students and parents, she was part of a faculty entrusted with guidance and care. That professional image tied to the values of a classroom stood in stark contrast to what unfolded inside the Solomon home. The relationship triangle grew out of the workplace. Warmus and Solomon began an affair while teaching at the same school, a boundary crossing that blurred professional and personal roles. Prosecutors would later frame her emotional world as a mix of jealousy, entitlement, and fear of losing control, the combustible feelings that can turn secrecy into pressure. Friends of the victim described a family adjusting to strain and suspicion. Whatever the private explanations, the power imbalance and the secrecy around a teacher's relationship with a colleague's marriage created a volatile context that should have prompted distance, not escalation. On a winter evening in the late 1980s, in the quiet of a Greenberg condominium, the violence that ended Betty Jeannie Solomon's life took place while Warmus was away from the home, a fact the state argued was part of a plan to construct an alibi. Investigators learned Warmus and Solomon had met for drinks earlier that night, a detail that became central to the timeline. The state's narrative emphasized manipulation and planning rather than a sudden outburst alleging that a romantic fantasy replaced the reality of a troubled affair. What shocked the public was not only a killing inside a suburban home, but the suspicion that an educator had set events in motion. Detectives pieced together phone records, witness statements, and later a disputed physical item that would dominate the retrial. A dark cashmere glove with traces of blood reportedly found in a closet after the first proceedings ended. Forensic advances were not yet routine, but the glove's story, where it came from, what it meant, loomed large. Years later, prosecutors would consent to modern DNA testing on that glove and on other preserved evidence, a reminder that the case has continued to echo through the system long after sentencing. Whatever those later developments, jurors during the second trial heard testimony that cast the glove as a link between the defendant and the scene. The legal path was winding. The first trial ended without a verdict when jurors could not agree. At the second trial the following year, the jury found Warmus guilty of second-degree murder and a related weapons offense. The trial judge imposed the maximum term permitted by law, a sentence measured in decades with the possibility that prison could last for the remainder of her life. Coverage at the time described a courtroom marked by quiet intensity and an unflinching sentence that mirrored the gravity of taking a life. Years later, after serving well over 2 decades, Warmus was granted parole and released under supervision. The decision drew renewed media attention to a case long labeled by headlines as the Fatal Attraction murder, a shorthand that highlighted the intersection of romance infidelity and lethal obsession. Even as parole changed her custodial status, the conviction remained intact, and prosecutors' later agreement to test old evidence did not alter the legal judgment. The family's losses and the community's memory remained. As for motive, the record points to jealousy and a desire to preserve a relationship that was already collapsing. There is no credible evidence of a sudden psychotic break. Rather, the state's case emphasized choices pressure on others and an effort to craft an alibi. Her position within a school community deepened the sense of betrayal for many observers. An educator carries implicit authority. When that authority is misused to cultivate secrecy and advance personal ends, the damage radiates outward from one home to a wider circle of students, parents, and colleagues who expect diligence and integrity. This story must close with moral clarity. Betty Jean Solomon was a daughter, a friend, and a wife whose life was cut short. A teacher, someone entrusted to model judgment and boundaries, helped create the path to that loss, and was held accountable in court. Whatever personal turmoil or heartbreak existed cannot excuse the harm. Justice, in this case, meant a firm verdict, a substantial sentence, and a lasting acknowledgement of the value of the life taken. We remember Betty Jean with respect and insist on a standard that never bends in schools and in homes when jealousy and obsession surface. The only responsible choices are distance help and intervention, never violence. 7. Jean Struven Harris. Jean Struven Harris was the headmistress of the Madeira School for Girls in McLean, Virginia, a polished educator known for discipline, eloquence, and an exacting moral code. In her mid-50s, at the time of the crime and arrest, she had built a reputation for scholarship and order, the kind of authority figure parents trusted and students feared a little. Away from the campus, she maintained a long and complicated romance with Dr. Herman Tarnower, a prominent Westchester cardiologist and best-selling diet author. The contrast between the poised school leader and the private turmoil that followed would shock the country. Pressure points had been gathering. Tarnower's relationships with other women, especially a younger assistant, strained a bond that had lasted for years. Friends and commentators described a cycle of jealousy and control, while some feminist writers later argued that Harris had endured emotional abuse. Supporters pointed to her deteriorating health and to prescription medications as elements in a mounting crisis. Critics saw a proud headmistress unwilling to let go. Whatever the lens, the emotional volatility was real, and it collided with a public role that demanded restraint and judgment. None of these factors excuse what happened next. They form the background of a tragedy. On a Monday night in early March of 1980, Harris drove to Tarnower's home in Purchase, New York, and confronted him. What happened inside that bedroom has been debated ever since. Harris later told investigators she had planned to take her own life and that the gun discharged during a struggle. Prosecutors argued she came to confront a faithless lover and pulled the trigger with intent. Several shots were fired. Tarnower was mortally wounded and Harris, distraught, was taken into custody. The case resonated far beyond Westchester because it involved a celebrated doctor and a headmistress whose life had seemed the model of order. Detectives built a timeline from witness statements, phone calls, and physical evidence at the scene. From the start, it was a media magnet. The trial in White Plains drew national attention and became an early example of gavel-to-gavel coverage, with anchors and reporters dissecting courtroom moments for a captivated audience. Commentators noted how a private love affair had been pulled into the fluorescent light of a courtroom and turned into a referendum on class, gender, and power. For the families involved, it was simply grief under a spotlight. Harris faced a charge of second-degree murder. In late winter of the following year, a jury found her guilty. At sentencing a few weeks later, the judge imposed the mandatory term under New York law, a minimum of 15 years to life in prison. The severity of the punishment reflected the jury's rejection of accident or self-harm and the state's conclusion that a deliberate crime had occurred. She entered the Bedford Hills Correctional Facility, where she would spend the next decade. Prison did not end her identity as an educator. Harris taught classes, helped launch programs for incarcerated mothers and children, and was credited by officials and volunteers with improving access to education inside Bedford Hills. After nearly 12 years, New York's governor granted clemency, citing her age health and sustained service to fellow inmates. She underwent major heart surgery and was paroled soon afterward, her conviction intact and her sentence commuted to allow release. The decision rekindled debate, but it did not rewrite the history of the crime. As for motive, the record points to jealousy, fear of abandonment, and a struggle for control within a relationship already frayed. Harris's own account emphasized despair. The prosecution's narrative emphasized planning and intent. Expert labels are ultimately less important than the clear through line of choices made under pressure. Her role as a school leader deepened the public's sense of betrayal. An educator is expected to model boundaries, patience, and lawful conduct. When that trust is broken, the damage ripples from one home into an entire community of students, parents, and colleagues. This story must close with moral clarity. Herman Tarnower was a physician, a colleague, and a loved one whose life was taken. The person responsible for that loss had been entrusted with guiding young people and upholding standards of integrity. Whatever personal hurt or humiliation she felt, it does not mitigate accountability. The verdict and sentence affirmed that principle, and the years since have not altered it. We remember Herman Tarnower with respect, acknowledge the continuing sorrow of those who knew him, and insist on a standard that should never bend. When relationships deteriorate, the only responsible path is distance, help, and intervention, never violence.